All right, good morning, friends. Today we're going to read a story called Enemy Pie. And what I want you to be listening to is I want you to be listening to the characters in the story. I want you to be listening to the setting, where and when the story takes place. And I also want you to be thinking about the plot of the story. What happens at the beginning of the story, what happens in the middle of the story, and what happens at the end of the story. And we're also going to be listening for why something happens or how it happens. And we're going to draw conclusions, meaning we're going to be detectives to understand. So we're going to use all of those skills that we've been talking about this year when we've been reading stories. And we're going to use them to answer all kinds of questions in Enemy Pie today. Okay? So I want you to listen very carefully. My story is called Enemy Pie. It's by Derek Munson, who's the author. That means he writes the story, and it's illustrated by Tara Callahan King, and that means that if she's the illustrator, she draws the pictures. Very good. So my story is called Enemy Pie. It should have been a perfect summer. My dad helped me build a tree house in our backyard. My sister was at camp for 3 whole weeks, and I was on the best baseball team in town. It should have been a perfect summer, but it wasn't. It was all good until Jeremy Ross moved into the neighborhood right next door to my best friend Stanley. I did not like Jeremy Ross. He laughed at me when he struck me out in a baseball game. He had a party on his trampoline, and I wasn't even invited, but my best friend Stanley was. Jeremy Ross was the one and only person on my enemy list. I never even had an enemy list until he moved into the neighborhood. But as soon as he came along, I needed one. I hung it up in my treehouse where Jeremy Ross was not allowed to go. So an enemy's not a good thing, right? Dad understood stuff like enemies. He told me that when he was my age, he had enemies too. But he knew a great way to get rid of them. I asked him to tell me how. Tell you how? I'll show you how, he said. And he pulled a really old recipe book off of the kitchen shelf. Inside, there was a worn-out scrap of paper with faded writing. Dad held it up and squinted at it. Enemy Pie, he said, satisfied. Enemy Pie, does that sound good? You may be wondering exactly what enemy pie is. I was wondering too, but Dad said the recipe was so secret he couldn't even tell me. I decided it must be magic. I begged him to tell me something, anything. I will tell you this, he said. Enemy pie is the fastest known way to get rid of enemies. Now, of course, this got my mind working. What kinds of things, disgusting things, would I put into a pie for an enemy? I brought Dad some weeds from the garden, but he just shook his head. I brought him earthworms and rocks, but he didn't think he'd need any of those. I gave him the gum I'd been chewing on all morning. He gave it right back to me. I went out to play alone. I shot baskets until the ball got stuck on the roof. I threw a boomerang that never came back to me. And all the while, I listened to the sounds of my dad chopping and stirring and blending the ingredients of enemy pie. This could be a great summer after all. Enemy pie was going to be awful. I tried to imagine how horrible it must smell, or worse yet, what it would look like. But when I was in the backyard looking for ladybugs, I smelled something really, really, really good. And as far as I could tell, it was something, and it was coming from our kitchen. I was a little bit confused. Should enemy pie smell good, do you think? I went in to ask Dad what was wrong. Enemy pie shouldn't smell this good. But Dad was smart. If enemy pie smelled bad, your enemy would never eat it, he said. I could tell he had made enemy pie before. The buzzer rang, and I had put on the oven mitts and pulled the pie out of the oven. It looked like plain old pie. It looked good enough to eat. I was catching on. But still I wasn't really sure how this enemy pie worked. What exactly did it do to enemies? Maybe it made their hair fall out, or their breath stinky. Maybe it made bullies cry. I asked Dad, but he was no help. He wouldn't tell me a thing. But while the pie cooled, he filled me in on what my job was. That pie looks pretty good for enemy pie. He talked quietly. There is one part of enemy pie that I can't do. In order for it to work, you need to spend the whole day with your enemy. Even worse, you have to be nice to him. It's not easy, but that's the only way enemy pie can work. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Of course I was. It sounded horrible. It was scary, but it was worth a try. All I had to do was spend one day with Jeremy Ross. Then he'd be out of my hair for the rest of my life. I rode my bike to his house and knocked on his door. When Jeremy opened the door, he seemed surprised. He stood on the other side of the screen door and looked at me, waiting for me to say something. I was nervous. "Can you play?" I asked. He looked confused. "I'll go ask my mom," he said, and he came back with his shoes in his hand, and his mom walked around the corner to say hello. "You boys stay out of trouble," she said, smiling. Now, why do you think he might have been nervous? Because they had never been friends before, right? And he said he was his enemy. And then he comes to his house asking him to play. We rode bikes for a while and played on the trampoline. Then we made some water balloons and threw them at the neighbor girls. But we missed. They shouldn't have been throwing them. Jeremy's mom made us lunch. After lunch, we went over to my house. It was strange, but I was kind of having fun with my enemy. He almost seemed nice. But of course, I couldn't tell Dad that since he had worked so hard to make this enemy pie. Jeremy Ross liked my basketball hoop. He said he wished he had a basketball hoop, but they didn't have room for one. I let him win a game, just to be nice. So now all of a sudden he's having fun with Jeremy, right? Could be a problem for that enemy pie. Jeremy Ross knew how to throw a boomerang. He threw it and it came right back to him. Remember when he threw his and it went and it didn't come back to him? I threw it and went over my house and into the backyard. When we climbed over the fence to find it, the first thing Jeremy noticed was my new tree house. So there's his boomerang. It went up over, but Jeremy knows how to throw one. My tree house was my tree house. I was the boss. If my sister wanted in, I didn't have to let her. If my dad wanted in, I didn't have to let him. And if Jeremy wanted in, "Can we go in?" he asked. I knew he was going to ask me that, but he was the top person, the only person on my enemy list. And enemies aren't allowed in my treehouse. But he did teach me how to throw a boomerang. And he did have me over for lunch. And he did let me play on his trampoline. He wasn't being a very good enemy anymore. "Okay," I said, "but hold on." Do you remember what's up in his treehouse? I climbed up ahead of him and tore the enemy list off my wall. I had a checkerboard and some cards in the treehouse, and we played games until my dad called us down for dinner. We pretended we didn't hear him, and when he came out to get us, we tried to hide from him, but somehow he found us. Sounds like these enemies are actually having a really good day together. Dad made us macaroni and cheese for dinner, my favorite. It was Jeremy's favorite too. Maybe Jeremy Ross wasn't so bad after all. I was beginning to think that maybe we should just forget about enemy pie. But sure enough, after dinner, Dad brought out the pie. I watched as he put the pie and cut it into thick 8 pieces. "Dad," I said, "it sure is nice having a new friend in the neighborhood." I was trying to get his attention and tell him not to give Jeremy Ross a piece of enemy pie because he was no longer my enemy. But Dad only smiled and nodded. I think he thought I was just pretending. So he doesn't want Jeremy to eat the enemy pie because he's not his enemy anymore. Dad dished up 3 plates side by side with big pieces of pie and giant scoops of ice cream. He passed one to me and one to Jeremy. "Wow," said Jeremy, looking at the pie. "My dad never makes pies like this." It was at this point that I panicked. I didn't want Jeremy to eat enemy pie. He was my friend. I couldn't let him eat it. Jeremy, don't eat it. It's bad pie. I think it's poisonous or something. Jeremy's fork stopped before reaching his mouth. He crumpled his eyebrows and looked at me funny. I felt relieved. I had saved his life. I was a hero. Do you think it's really poisonous pie? If it's so bad, Jeremy asked, then why has your dad already eaten half of it? I turned to look at my dad, and sure enough, he was eating enemy pie. Good stuff, he mumbled through a mouthful, and that was all he said. I sat there watching them eat enemy pie for a few seconds. Dad was laughing, Jeremy was happily eating, and neither of them was losing any hair. It seemed safe enough, so I took a tiny taste. Enemy pie was delicious. After dessert, Jeremy rode his bike home, but not before inviting me over to play on his trampoline in the morning. He said he'd teach me how to flip. As for enemy pie, I still don't know how to make it. I still wonder if enemies really do hate it, or if their hair falls out, or if their breath turns bad. But I don't know if I'll ever get an answer, because I just lost my best enemy. So at the end of the story, Jeremy, Ross, and the boy, are they enemies anymore? Very good. All right, so who are the characters in the story? We've got the boy, the dad, Jeremy, right? And then there was that boy, Stanley, right? Stanley, who was the best friend, but we don't really see him much in the story. And we also have Jeremy's mom and the girls that they were throwing the water balloons at, which they shouldn't have been doing. Exactly. All right. When does this story take place? What time of year? During the summer. Very good. And where does it take place at? It takes place at the boy's house, Jeremy's house. And where do they live? They live in a neighborhood just like us, right? Very good. All right. What happens in the beginning of the story? He's so excited for the whole summer, right? Looking forward to the summer. It's going to be the best summer ever. And then what happens? Jeremy Ross moves in next door to his best friend, Stanley, right? And they start to... He doesn't like Jeremy because Jeremy laughed when he struck him out at baseball. And he wasn't invited to Jeremy's party, but Stanley was, right? So it's understandable. That's why the boy didn't really like him, because his feelings were hurt, okay? Dad decided to do what? Help him overcome this by making what? By making enemy pie, right? Okay. So if we think back, because Dad said enemy pie is the fastest way to get rid of their enemies, right? So when the boy hears about enemy pie, what does he think should go in enemy pie? Okay, so we go back. So here's Dad starting to put things into enemy pie, but the boy, I'm going to read it again. He said, what kinds of things, disgusting things, would I put into enemy pie? I brought Dad some weeds from the garden. He said no. I brought him earthworms and rocks, and I gave him the gum I had been chewing. And what did Dad do with all of that stuff? He gave it back to him. He said, nope, that's not what we're putting in enemy pie, okay? So what does he think will happen from the enemy pie? What was one of the things he said? He thought maybe the hair would fall out, right? Get stinky breath, all those good things coming from enemy pie. All right. So why don't you think Dad used any of those ingredients? Now knowing the story, why don't you think Dad used any of those ingredients? Because he was secretly making a good pie, right? And if we put in rocks and earthworms and chewed up bubble gum and weeds, would that be a very good pie? It wouldn't be tasty at all, right? So, but what did Dad say you had to do? What did Dad say? He said, I can make this delicious pie, but you have a really big job. And what did he tell the boy he had to do? One, he had to spend the whole day with his enemy. He had to be nice and have fun with his enemy, right? So what are some of the things that they did during the day? What are some of the things that they did together? They rode bikes. At Jeremy's house, what did they do? They rode bikes, they played on a trampoline, they ate lunch, and they threw those water balloons at the girls, right? But they missed. At the boys' house in the story, what did they do? They played basketball, they played with the boomerang, and they ate mac and cheese. And more importantly, he let who into his treehouse? He let Jeremy come up into his treehouse. Okay, so did the boy do all the things that his dad told him he had to do? Spend the whole day with his enemy, be nice to his enemy, have fun with his enemy? He did. He did all of those things. So when they did all of that, what happens at the end of the story when he has Jeremy come over? He tries to stop him from eating the enemy pie, right? He realizes that Jeremy's going to eat it. And what did he say? He said, he's no longer my enemy, so I don't want him to eat that pie. Because remember back, what did he say? He thought his hair would fall out, his breath would get stinky, right? So he's really nervous. He doesn't want any of that to happen to Jeremy now. What makes him realize it's okay? They look over and Dad is eating the pie, right? Dad has already eaten half of the pie. And Jeremy says, well, if your dad's eating it, why can't I eat it? And so they all end up eating the pie together. All right, so using Dad's recipe for making enemy pie, he baked a delicious pie. The boy spent the whole day with his enemy. He was nice to his enemy. He was having fun with his enemy. What did he say would happen? Because actually, when he did all of that, he lost his best enemy. So now Jeremy is his friend. Very good. All right, so sometimes instead of being mean to someone you think is your enemy, if you actually try being nice to them and maybe play with them, you might find out that your worst enemy could become your best friend. And I think that's what the boy in the story learned through his dad helping him. But all his dad did was make the pie, right? The boy was the one that had the big job of spending the day with Jeremy and learning. And I think Jeremy got his new best friend too. All right, so today what you're going to do is we talked about what Dad said needed to go into the enemy pie. Bake a delicious pie, spend the day with your enemy, have fun with them, end up losing your best enemy because of the enemy pie by spending the day together. The boy, I want you to go back and I want you to think about it, and you have this worksheet. The boy had different ideas about what ingredients were supposed to go into his enemy pie. What I'd like you to do is we read it and then we went back over. I'd like you to remember what were those things that the boy said should go into the enemy pie. So you're going to write your name up at the top of the page. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to remember, okay, there were a couple things that the boy said should go into the enemy pie. And I would like you to go back and I'd like you to remember what were those. There were 4 things that he said should go into the enemy pie. Those were the 4 things that he brought his dad. I'd like you to try to remember those things that he said he was going to bring to his dad, or that he brought to his dad, that he thought should go into enemy pie. And I'd like you to draw them on there. And then on Flipgrid, you're going to let me know what were those 4 things that the boy thought he should put into enemy pie. All right? All right. Good job, friends.